The dust of the main street was a shroud, stirred by a wind that had no kindness in it. It coated the three of them, a matched set of misery standing on the raw timber of the auction block. They were not for sale in the usual sense. There was no profit in them. They were a burden to be offloaded, a problem the town of Redemption had voted to solve with the least possible expense. The eldest girl stood straightest. Her spine was a thin, unbending line against the bleached-out blue of the sky. Her hair, the color of dry straw, was pulled back tight, but strands had escaped to whip across a face set like stone. She held a small hand on either side of her, her fingers wrapped around the wrists of the two smaller children, as if they were the only anchor in a swirling, hostile world. The boy, Samuel, was maybe 6. His gaze was fixed on the scuffed toes of his own bare feet. He leaned into his sister's grip, a slight, constant pressure that was both a plea and a statement of fact. He was hers to protect, and she was failing. The little one, Rose, was no more than 4. She did not understand the words the man with the loud voice was using, but she understood the tone. It was the same tone men used before they kicked a stray dog. Her thumb was wedged in her mouth, her eyes wide and dark, tracking the faces in the small crowd. They were hard faces, weathered by sun and suspicion. The auctioneer, a portly man named Gable who also ran the general store, mopped his brow. His voice was oiled with false piety. A sad situation, folks. A real tragedy. But we are a Christian town, and we will see these little ones provided for. Who will take on this charitable duty? Who has room in their heart and their home? Silence answered him. It was a heavy, judging silence. The wind kicked up a tumbleweed, and it rolled past the block like a sigh from the land itself. A woman in a severe black bonnet muttered to her neighbor, "Mouths to feed, and Lord knows what sickness they carry." The eldest girl's knuckles were white where she gripped her siblings. She felt the tremor that ran through Samuel's arm, a fear so pure it was like a vibration in the air. She did not look at the faces. She looked past them, to the jagged line of the mountains that walled them in. The mountains were gray and indifferent. They promised nothing. Gable cleared his throat, his patience thinning. "Come now. It's a matter of civic and moral duty. They can work. The girl's old enough to help in a kitchen. The boy can learn to chop wood." He was selling livestock. He was selling tools. Still nothing. The sun beat down. The girl felt a trickle of sweat trace a path through the grime on her temple. Rose began to whimper, a thin, desolate sound that the wind snatched away. Then a shift in the crowd. A man at the back, who had been leaning against the raw-boned wall of the livery stable, pushed himself upright. He was tall, thin as a fence rail inside a dusty, canvas duster that had seen too many winters. His face was all angles and shadow under the brim of a stained hat. He carried whole winters in his eyes. Elias had not come to town for this. He had come for salt and flour, a journey he made only when the emptiness of his cabin became more pressing than the emptiness of his pantry. He had watched the spectacle unfold with a familiar ache in his chest, a dull throb of disgust at the world and its casual cruelties. He had planned to turn away, to collect his supplies and retreat back to the silence of his mountain. But the little one's whimper had caught him. It was a sound that knew no words, only loss. And he had seen the way the older girl stood, a sapling in a hurricane, refusing to bend. He saw the defiance in the set of her shoulders, a mirror to the granite of the peaks behind her. He moved forward, his worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. The crowd parted for him slightly, a mixture of fear and disdain in their eyes. The mountain man, the widower, the one who spoke more to the wind than to people. Gable's eyes lit with a predator's hope. "Elias, surely a man with a homestead as large as yours has a use for some willing hands." Elias stopped before the block. He did not look at Gable. His gaze rested on the 3 children. He saw the dirt, the hunger, the fear that clung to them like wet paper. He saw 3 frayed threads, cut loose and about to be swept away. His voice, when it came, sounded like it came from under floorboards, rough and unused. "How much?" Gable blinked, thrown by the directness. Much? It is not a sale, Elias. It is a Christian duty. How much? Elias repeated, the words flat and hard as river stones. For the town's trouble. Avarice flickered in Gable's eyes. He saw a fool. Well, there's the cost of their upkeep. Feeding them these past few days. $1, perhaps, for each of them. To go into the church collection box, of course. Elias's hand went into the pocket of his duster. The movement was slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and tipped 3 silver dollars into his calloused palm. The coins were dull, heavy with the sweat and labor they represented. He held them out. He did not offer them to Gable. He looked at the eldest girl. His eyes met hers for the first time. They were the color of a stormy sky, and for a split second, she saw not pity, but a shared and terrible understanding. He held the coins out, his palm flat. An offering. A question. She stared at the coins, then back at his face. He was not smiling. His expression had not changed, but his eyes were waiting. She felt the choice settle on her shoulders, a weight heavier than her brother's hand. The town offered charity that felt like a cage. This man offered what? She did not know, but he was asking, not telling. Slowly, she released her sibling's wrists. She stepped forward a single, shaky step. She reached out a hand, fingers trembling, and took the 3 coins from his palm. Her skin was cold against his. She turned and walked back to Gable, her back to the mountain man. She held out the coins. For your trouble, she said, her voice a thin, rusty whisper. It was the first time she had spoken. Gable stared, dumbfounded, at the money in her small, grimy hand. He took it, his bluster gone. The transaction was done. It was not the one he had intended. Elias gestured with his head toward the path that led out of town, the one that climbed into the foothills. He said nothing. He simply turned and began to walk. The girl picked up Rose, settling her small weight on her hip. She took Samuel's hand again, and without a backward glance at the town of redemption, she followed the silent man into the vast, waiting landscape. The journey was a silent one. The man, Elias, walked ahead, his stride long and steady, never once looking back to see if they were following. He seemed a part of the land itself, his dusty coat the color of the dry earth, his silence as deep as the shadows that stretched from the pines. The girl kept her focus on his back. It was a fixed point in a world that had dissolved into dust and sky. Rose was a leaden weight on her hip, her small body gone limp with a fretful sleep. Samuel stumbled beside her, his breath coming in short, ragged puffs. The air grew thinner as they climbed, tasting of pine and cold stone. After an hour, Samuel fell. It was not a dramatic collapse, just a quiet folding of his legs, his body slumping into the dirt of the trail without a sound. He did not cry. He simply lay there, defeated. The girl stopped. She shifted Rose in her arms, her own muscles screaming in protest. She looked at her brother's small form, then at the unmoving back of the man some 20 paces ahead. He had not stopped. For a terrible moment, she thought he would just keep walking, that he would disappear over the next rise and leave them there. The silence of the mountain pressed in, vast and absolute. Then he stopped. He did not turn. He stood for a long moment, his shoulders set. He seemed to be listening to something she could not hear. Finally, he turned around. His eyes took in the scene, the girl burdened with the toddler, the boy in the dust. His face was unreadable, a mask carved from weathered wood. He walked back to them, his boots scuffing softly on the trail. He stopped in front of Samuel and looked down. He did not speak. He simply bent, scooped the boy up in one arm as if he weighed no more than a sack of flour, and stood. Samuel, limp with exhaustion, rested his head against the man's chest without protest. Elias looked at the girl. He gestured with his chin to the canteen hanging at his hip. It was his only wordless question. She nodded, her throat too tight and dry to speak. He unhooked it, uncorked it, and passed it to her. The water was cool and tasted of metal and earth. She drank sparingly, then held it to Rose's lips. The little girl drank greedily in her sleep, a small, instinctive motion. He took the canteen back, hung it on his belt, and turned to resume the climb, now carrying the boy. He adjusted his pace, slowing it just enough for her to keep up without struggling. It was the first kindness. It was a language she understood better than words. They walked for what felt like the rest of the day. The sun slid behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brutal strokes of blood orange and bruised purple. The air turned sharp and cold. Just as the last light failed, they crested a ridge and saw it. The cabin was small, built of dark, heavy logs, chinked with mud that had long since dried and cracked. It huddled against the mountainside as if for protection. A thin curl of smoke, now gray against the deepening twilight, rose from a stone chimney. It looked less like a home and more like a scar on the landscape, lonely and defiant. A single, small window glowed with a faint, welcoming warmth. Someone or something was already there. The girl's heart seized. Elias saw her hesitate. "My neighbor," he said, the words gruff. "Martha asked her to start a fire." He walked toward the door and pushed it open without knocking. The inside was one room. It was spare and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of something bubbling over the flames. A rough-hewn table with two benches stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner, a simple cot into another. In the dim, flickering light, the room felt both vast and claustrophobic. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and loneliness. An older woman, her face a web of fine lines, turned from the fire. She had Elias's same quiet stillness. She looked from Elias and the sleeping boy in his arms to the girl and the toddler on her hip. Her eyes, pale and knowing, held no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness. "Elias," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "Martha," he replied. He carried Samuel to the cot and laid him down gently, pulling a coarse wool blanket over him. Martha looked at the girl. "You must be hungry." It was a statement, not a question. The girl could only nod, her exhaustion a physical weight that threatened to pull her to the floor. Martha ladled a thick stew into 3 bowls. She set them on the table. Elias took his place on one bench. He looked at the girl, then at the empty space opposite him. It was an invitation. She slid onto the bench, placing Rose beside her. The little girl stirred, her nose twitching at the smell of food. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls and the crackle of the fire. The stew was simple venison and root vegetables, but it was hot and filling, and it chased away some of the deep, trembling cold that had settled in her bones. When they were done, Martha took the bowls. She did not try to make conversation. She moved to the door. "I'll leave the extra bread," she said to Elias. "There's milk from my goat for the little ones in the morning." She paused, her hand on the latch, her gaze resting on the children again. "You did a good thing, Elias. A hard thing, but a good 1 inch. Elias just nodded, his eyes on the fire. Martha left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving them alone in the quiet cabin. The room was suddenly very small. The silence was different now, more intimate. The girl felt the man's presence like a physical pressure. She watched him. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of light and shadow. She wondered what he saw there. She wondered what he had bought for his 3 silver dollars. He seemed to feel her gaze. He looked up. "The loft," he said, his voice quiet. He pointed toward a sturdy ladder leading to a dark space above. "It's dry. There are blankets." It was her space. Separate. Safe. He stood and went to the main bed in the corner. He did not undress, simply removed his boots and lay down on top of the covers, turning his face to the wall. She carried the now sleeping Rose up the ladder. The loft was small, smelling of dried herbs and old wood. A thick pile of clean, folded wool blankets lay waiting. She made a soft bed for Rose, then one for herself. She lay down, pulling a blanket up to her chin. Through the gaps in the floorboards, She could see the embers of the fire glowing below. She could hear the slow, steady breathing of the man and her brother. The house was breathing, too. It was a quiet, sleeping sound. For the first time in more days than she could count, she was not cold. She was not on display. A door was not locked on her. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, sleep came not as a surrender, but as a refuge. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, as steady and quiet as the turning of the earth. Life on the mountain was measured not in hours, but in tasks. Chopping wood, hauling water, mending what was broken. Elias never gave orders. He simply did what needed doing, and the girl watched and learned. When he took his axe to the woodpile, she gathered the split logs and stacked them by the cabin door. When he went to check his trap lines, she swept the cabin floor with a broom made of bundled twigs, erasing the day's dust and leaving the scent of damp earth in its place. They worked in parallel, two solitary planets orbiting the small star of the hearth. The silence between them was not empty. It was a space they furnished with shared labor. It was a language of its own, spoken in the swing of an axe, the scrape of a bucket, the rhythmic scrub of a brush on worn floorboards. The younger children became the bridge. Samuel, once he recovered his strength, shadowed Elias with a silent, canine devotion. He would sit for an hour, watching the man mend a harness, his small face a study in concentration. Elias, in turn, began to leave small, carved animals on the boy's cot, a clumsy-looking bird, a bear with 2 long ears. He never acknowledged giving them, and the boy never acknowledged receiving them, but they appeared, and they were treasured. Rose was the light. She chased dust motes in the sunbeams that slanted through the window and made the cabin ring with laughter that sounded like tiny bells. She would toddle over to Elias as he sat by the fire mending a boot and pat his knee with her chubby hand before moving on to her next discovery. Each time, the girl saw a flicker of something in the man's eyes, a pain so deep it was almost reverence. One afternoon, while Elias was gone, the girl took the children outside. She led them past the woodpile to a small, fenced-off square of land a short way from the cabin. It was a grave. A simple wooden marker stood at its head, the name on it weathered nearly to oblivion by years of wind and snow. The earth was hard-packed and barren, choked with weeds. She had seen Elias stand here sometimes, in the gray light of dawn, his hat in his hands. He never did anything. He just stood, a statue of grief, before turning back to the relentless work of living. With her bare hands, she began to pull the weeds. Samuel, seeing her, joined in, his small fingers digging into the stubborn soil. Rose sat nearby, collecting interesting pebbles. They worked all afternoon, clearing the plot until it was just bare, clean earth. Then the girl walked to the edge of the woods and gathered a handful of pale, hardy mountain wildflowers. She arranged them in a small, pathetic bunch at the base of the wooden marker. When Elias returned at dusk, he stopped short of the cabin. He saw the cleared ground, the small splash of color against the weathered wood. He looked at the girl, who was watching him from the doorway, her face shadowed and uncertain. He did not speak. He did not nod. He simply went to the woodpile, picked up a larger load of firewood than was necessary, and carried it inside. But that evening, when he ladled the stew, he put an extra piece of venison in her bowl. A week later, a late autumn storm blew in, a vicious, shrieking thing that threw sleet against the window pane like handfuls of gravel. The wind turned mean, clawing at the chinking between the logs. They were sealed inside the cabin, the world reduced to the circle of firelight. The girl was mending a tear in Samuel's shirt, her stitches small and even. Elias was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a counterpoint to the howling wind. The children were asleep, Samuel on his cot, Rose nestled in the blankets of the loft. The storm's fury seemed to invade the room, making the silence feel thin and fragile. The girl found herself looking at the man, at the hard lines of his jaw illuminated by the fire. A question had been sitting in her chest for days, a heavy, unasked thing. The storm gave her the courage to voice it. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was so quiet it was almost lost in the shriek of the wind. Elias did not stop the motion of his hands. The stone continued its steady scrape against the blade. Why what? Why did you take us? He finished sharpening the blade, testing its edge with a careful thumb. He set the knife and stone aside. He looked into the fire, and for a long time, she thought he would not answer. The cabin breathed around them. The wind moaned. My wife, he said, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being pulled from a deep, cold well. She could not have children. It was a sorrow to her. A great sorrow. He paused, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. She always said a house isn't a home without the sound of little feet, that it's just a box to keep the rain out. He fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was filled with the shape of the woman he was describing. The girl could almost see her, a ghost of warmth in the cold cabin. The house got quiet after she was gone, Elias continued, his voice barely a whisper. Too quiet. I saw you, in the town, and I heard how quiet you all were. It was the wrong kind of quiet. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with memories. I figured I could trade one kind of quiet for another. It was not the answer she expected. It was not about duty or charity or needing help. It was about emptiness. It was about echoes. It was something she understood. Later that night, the storm woke Rose. A great clap of thunder rattled the cabin, and a terrified wail came from the loft. The girl was already moving, but before she could climb down the ladder, Elias was on his feet. He crossed the room and stood at the base of the ladder, looking up into the darkness. It's just the sky making noise, he said, his voice steady and calm. It can't get in. The walls are strong. Rose's crying softened to a hiccuping whimper. The girl looked down from the loft and saw the tall, gaunt man standing guard below. He was not offering comfort in the way a mother would. He was offering a fact. You are safe here. He stood there for a long time, until the whimpers stopped and the only sound was the storm and the steady breathing of a sleeping child. The girl lay back down in her blankets, the man's words echoing in her mind. The walls are strong. She pulled the wool tight around her shoulders and felt the truth of it settle deep inside her. For the first time, she believed it might be true. The first snow came, a soft, silent blanket that muffled the world and made the cabin an island in a sea of white. The routine deepened. The quiet comfort they had stitched together with raw thread became a sturdy fabric. The girl learned to bake a dense, heavy bread that Elias never complimented but always finished. He, in turn, repaired the worn soles of her shoes with a piece of thick leather, leaving them by the hearth without a word. One morning, the girl watched him trying to mend his last good shirt. His fingers, calloused and clumsy from years of handling an axe, struggled with the fine work of the needle. He grunted in frustration as he pricked his thumb for the third time. Later, when he was outside, she took the shirt. She sat by the fire, the small garment in her lap, and set to work. Her stitches were neat and small, a tidy line that closed the wound in the fabric. She darned the frayed cuff and reinforced the buttonholes. When she was done, she folded it and left it on his bed. That evening he wore it. He said nothing about it, but as he sat cleaning his rifle, he spoke into the quiet. The bread was a little dry today. The girl looked up from where she was shelling beans. A spark of something unfamiliar, something warm, flickered in her chest. You didn't complain about mine, she said, her voice soft. A corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. Yours wasn't dry. It was a joke. A small, plain thing, but it hung in the air between them like a fragile ornament. A sign that the long winter in his soul was beginning, just barely, to thaw. The threat arrived on a day when the world seemed to be holding its breath. The snow had melted back in patches, leaving the land a mottled brown and white. The air was still and cold, carrying sound for miles. That was how they heard the horses first, a distant, rhythmic crunching on the trail long before the riders came into view. Elias was splitting wood. He stopped mid-swing, the axe held aloft, his head cocked. He was listening. The girl came to the cabin door, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from a flour sack. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the sudden stillness that was not peace, but a predator's watchfulness. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat. "Take the children to the loft. Stay away from the window." She did not question him. She gathered Samuel and Rose, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She herded them up the ladder into the dim space above, her hands trembling as she settled them into the nest of blankets. "It's a game," she whispered, her voice tight. "We have to be very, very quiet." Through a crack in the floorboards she watched. 3 riders emerged from the treeline. The man in the middle was Gable, the store owner, his bulk spilling over the sides of his saddle. The other 2 were grim-faced townsmen she recognized from the auction. They looked uncomfortable, their eyes shifting nervously toward the dark woods that ringed the clearing. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from where Elias stood. He had not moved. He just waited, the axe held loosely at his side. It was not a weapon, not yet. It was a tool. And he was a man who knew how to use his tools. "Elias?" Gable called out, his voice straining for a friendly tone that the cold air rejected. "Just making a wellness check." The town was concerned. "They're well," Elias said. The words were stones dropped into a deep well. Gable shifted in his saddle. "That's good to hear. Real good. Thing is, Elias, there's been some talk. A formal complaint, you might say, from Preacher Martin. He feels a moral claim was overlooked." "He wasn't there," Elias stated. "No, but he'd spoken to me previously," Gable blustered, his face turning red. "He was prepared to offer them a good Christian home. The town council has discussed it. We feel an error was made. A mountain bachelor. It ain't a fit place for children. Especially not for a young girl, coming into her own." The insinuation hung in the air, vile and sticky. The girl in the loft felt a cold fury rise in her, a feeling so sharp and clean it burned away her fear. From her hiding place, she saw Elias's knuckles turn white around the handle of the axe. But his voice, when he spoke, remained level. "She is not property, Gable. You can't change your mind on a sale." "It wasn't a sale. It was a dispensation of a burden." Gable's voice rose, cracking with frustration. "We're here to correct the situation. We'll take them back to town where they belong. The preacher is waiting." "This is where they belong," Elias said. He took one step forward. It was a small movement, but it changed everything. It was a line drawn in the dirt. "This is their home now." "Now, Elias, don't be unreasonable," Gable said. But his horse sensed the shift in the air and sidestepped nervously. "There are 3 of us. We've come to take the children." Elias did not answer. He simply looked at them, his eyes holding the cold, implacable judgment of the mountain itself. The 2 men with Gable would not meet his gaze. They looked at the trees, at the sky, at anything but the still figure with the axe. They were men of the town, men of fences and small talk. They were not made for this kind of silence, this kind of confrontation. The standoff stretched, thin and tight as a wire. The girl's breath was trapped in her throat. She looked down at her own hands. They were no longer the hands of a helpless victim. They were hands that could knead bread, and mend clothes, and pull weeds from a grave. They were hands that could fight. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open below. The girl looked down in horror. She had not secured it. Samuel, his small face pale but determined, stood in the doorway. He held one of the carved wooden birds Elias had made for him. He took 2 steps out onto the porch and threw the little bird with all his might. It tumbled end over end and landed in the dirt a few feet in front of Gable's horse. The horse shied violently, snorting in alarm. It was a child's act, small and futile, but it broke the spell. Before Gable could react, the girl was down the ladder. She did not think. She moved. She ran out onto the porch, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood from the stack by the door. She stood beside Samuel in front of the door, planting her feet wide. She held the log like a club, her small body trembling with a rage that made her feel 10 feet tall. She looked directly at Gable, her storm-gray eyes burning. "You will not take us," she said. Her voice did not whisper. It did not tremble. It rang out in the cold, clear air, sharp and certain as the crack of a rifle. Elias turned his head slightly, just enough to see her. To see both of them, standing on the porch of his home, defending it. A small, fierce girl and a defiant little boy. His family. A strange, broken sound came from Elias's chest. It might have been a laugh or it might have been a sob. He turned his gaze back to the three men. The fight had gone out of them. They had come to bully a lonely man and claim some chattel. They had not come to fight a family. They had not come to face a girl who looked like she would die before she took another step backward. "I think you should go now," Elias said. His voice was very quiet. Gable looked from Elias's unmoving form, to the fierce girl with her makeshift club, to his two wavering companions. He saw no victory here, only the potential for a shame that would follow him all the way back to town. He pulled viciously on his reins, turning his horse. "This isn't over, Elias," he spat, but the words had no weight. They were just noise against the great silence of the mountain. He spurred his horse and rode away, his men following close behind, like dogs with their tails between their legs. They did not look back. The girl stood on the porch, the heavy log still clutched in her hands, until the sound of the horses faded completely. The adrenaline drained out of her, leaving her weak and shaky. The firewood dropped from her grasp and thudded onto the porch boards. Elias walked over and stood before her. He looked down at her, his face still a mask of shadow. Then he reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to gently take Samuel's shoulder and steer him back toward the door. "It's cold," he said, his voice thick. "Go inside. Both of you." He followed them in, closing the door firmly behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was a final, definitive statement. The world was shut out. They were safe. He did not light a lamp. He went to the fireplace and stoked the embers, adding fresh logs until the fire roared back to life, pushing the shadows into the corners of the room. The girl sank onto the bench by the table, her legs unable to hold her. Samuel curled up beside her, pressing his face into her side. From the loft, Rose, who had slept through the entire ordeal, made a small, sleepy sound. Elias came to the table and sat opposite them. The firelight flickered across his face, and in its wild, dancing light, she saw that the winter in his eyes had finally broken. There were cracks in the ice. Something was shining through. He just looked at her, and she looked back at him. No words were needed. In the shared silence, a new contract was sealed, not with coins or labor, but with shared risk and fierce, defiant love. They were no longer just three orphans and a lonely man. They were a fortress, and the walls were strong. That night, after the simple meal was eaten and the children were asleep, the girl sat by the fire, mending the tear on Samuel's shirt for a second time. Elias sat in his usual spot, cleaning a rifle he had already cleaned twice that week. The quiet between them was deep and comfortable, a well-worn blanket. The girl finished her stitches. She looked at the small, neat patch, a scar that made the fabric stronger than it was before. She thought of the grave outside, the one she tended. She had spent hours there, tracing the faint, weathered letters on the marker with her finger, sounding them out in a whisper until they formed a name she had never heard spoken aloud. She looked at Elias, at his stoic silhouette against the fire. He was a good man, a sad man. He had given them a home. He had given them safety. He had stood for them. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that the woman under the frozen ground would have wanted this. She would have wanted the house to be full of the wrong kind of quiet, the quiet of sleeping children, not the hollow quiet of loss. "Elias," she said softly. He looked up, his hands stilling on the rifle. "I think," the girl said, her voice clear and steady in the warm room, "I think Lena would be proud of you." The name fell into the silence. Lena. Elias froze. The rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the floorboards. He stared at her, his face stripped bare by the firelight. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. It was a name he had not spoken himself in years. A name he had buried with his heart on this mountainside. He had never told them the name on that grave. He had never been able to. To hear it now, in this house, from this child he had saved from the dust, was like being struck by lightning. His composure, the granite wall he had built around himself for years, finally crumbled. His shoulders began to shake. A low, ragged sound was torn from his chest, the sound of a pain so old it had become a part of him. He dropped his face into his rough, calloused hands, and for the first time since his wife had been laid in the cold earth, Elias wept. The girl did not move. She did not speak. She sat and bore witness, her presence a quiet anchor in his storm of grief. She let him cry until the storm passed, until the ragged sobs softened into weary breaths. He finally lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear, as if the long fever had broken. He looked at her, not as a burden he had taken on, but as the one who had, in her own quiet way, just saved him. Her name was Lena, he whispered, as if confirming it to himself. Her name was Lena, he had said it. He had brought her back into the house. He stood, walked to the rough-hewn mantel over the fireplace, and reached for a small, dust-covered wooden box. He brought it to the table and opened it. Inside lay a few precious things. A pressed and faded wildflower, a lock of dark hair tied with a ribbon, and a small silver locket. He took the locket and held it out to the girl. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said. The girl took it. The silver was cool against her skin. She opened the clasp. Inside was a tiny, expertly painted portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Lena. She looked up at Elias, her own eyes shining. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice raw. In all this time he had never asked. She was just the girl. She closed her hand around the locket, the little piece of the past he had just given her. "Anna," she said. "Anna," he repeated. He tested the sound of it, a new word in his vocabulary, a new beginning. He looked at her, then at the sleeping forms of the other children. Anna, Samuel, and Rose. He was naming his family. He was naming his future. The fire settled into glowing embers. The house breathed around them, no longer haunted by a ghost of what was lost, but filled with the living, breathing promise of what had been found. On the porch, under a sky full of cold, distant stars, the world was quiet. And for the first time, it was not an empty quiet. It was the quiet of home. This story, it isn't just about a man rescuing 3 children from the dust. It's about how 4 lonely people, for broken pieces of the world, found a way to make a whole. It's about the fact that sometimes, the only way to heal your own deepest wounds is to find the courage to tend to someone else's. It's a reminder that a home isn't built from logs and nails. It's built from quiet kindness. It's fortified by shared silence. It's cemented by the moment you choose to stand for someone and the moment they choose to stand with you. It's about the naming of things, the naming of a fear, the naming of a long-buried grief, and the simple, sacred act of asking someone for their name and truly wanting to know it. So here is your naming. That ache you carry, that quiet sorrow you think no one sees, it has a name. And that fierce loyalty you hold for the ones you love, that too has a name. It is the language of the human heart, spoken not in grand speeches, but in a shared bowl of stew, in a mended shirt, in a weapon picked up to defend the door. Because a fire only changes things if something new is waiting in the ash. And if you are brave enough to walk through that ash, to reach for another's hand in the quiet that follows, you might just find you haven't